Welcome to Phil and Ted's Sexy Boomer Show with your hosts, Phil Proctor and Ted Bonnet. Phil and Ted's guest today is music and film producer and co-founder of the legendary Rhino Records, Harold Bronson. And now, your Sexy Boomer hosts, Phil Proctor and Ted Bonnet.
Welcome to Phil and Ted's Sexy Boomer Show. I'm Ted Bonnet.
And I'm Phil Proctor, and today we're honored to have a guest with us, Harold Bronson, who I have known for a long, wonderful time, creatively and personally. And he really brought the Firesign Theatre into Rhino Records, produced quite a few of our albums, and then has gone on to have an extended career beyond that that's been quite amazing, and I'm looking forward to catching up with you.
Yes, it'll be fun.
We want to talk to you about your remarkable career in music and film and your fascinating book about your travels in the 1970s to Europe to track down and meet the artists and bands that changed music in the 1960s and 70s. The title of your book is My British Invasion, the inside story on the Yardbirds, the Dave Clark Five, Manfred Mann, Herman's Hermits, the Hollies, the Troggs, the Kinks, the Zombies, and more.
So, you just read the book.
Yeah.
And you wrote this in 2017?
It was published in 2017, yeah.
Now, was it something that you were writing ongoing? Because it's filled with wonderful personal reminiscences of your contact with all these groups.
Well, I'll tell you.
Okay.
First of all, my background, when I first met you guys, I was in my 20s. I wrote about music for Rolling Stone and the rock magazines and the LA Times, and like anybody who would, pay me. And so it's a real reflection of the passion and interest I felt, which, kind of rolled in unexpectedly to Rhino and creating the Rhino label. So writing was always part of my background. And when I left Rhino, I thought, if I don't preserve the history of the company, it's going to be lost.
Right. So
the first book, which it took me a little while to get around to because of certain projects that I was still working on, the Rhino Records story was published in 2013.
Uh-huh.
So I felt that was the most important book. So there were a couple chapters because of length that I left out,
mm-hmm.
and which was dealing with and trying to reissue part of the Kinks catalog and Dave Clark, dealing with him in the Dave Clark 5 catalog. And then it occurred to me the artists of the British Invasion were always a big inspiration to me, and I was a real fan of the music. And so I just was kind of thinking that there was a lot of those artists that really, their histories weren't really covered that well or accurately. So there's a lot of books on the Beatles and Rolling Stones and the Who, but how about the Spencer Davis Group and the Yardbirds and Herman's Hermits and the Hollies and a lot of those others? And because of my passion, I'd interviewed a lot of those artists in the 1970s and felt that I got their stories, or at least enough to kind of be able to give people a good overview on it. There's 3 chapters of going to London, as a rock and roll fan. So the first one was in September 1972, when very few Americans, or at least, people my age, went over to London because of, it wasn't that expensive, but it was a certain amount of expense, and so they didn't really see that many Americans like me. One thing that kind of really struck me, being that I was very shy, not that I wouldn't talk to anybody, but when I was in kind of the rock and roll circles of maybe an event with other writers or record companies, but I was really struck by there wasn't any curiosity. Like nobody ever really asked me questions of, what's the rock and roll scene like in Los Angeles or anything like that, which obviously worked against my shyness. But so the thing is, I thought, well, okay, I'm going to London. Who could I interview, who never comes to Los Angeles?
Right.
And there were, a handful of people, but probably the best example was the Troggs, who had a big hit with Wild Thing. Of course, Jimi Hendrix also did Wild Thing, and their other big U.S. hit was Love Is All Around.
Yeah.
They did have a good run in England. I mean, they had lots of hits, maybe 10 top 10 hits or something like that. So I kind of tracked them down, and I was sitting in a room. I interviewed them, and it was like it was a real. Aside from the fact that they were good guys and funny, and I got their story, and I mean, they would talk about when I think they only did one kind of small tour in the U.S., but they talked about when they went to New York, like the big sandwiches, that they would get, things like that. Just aside from the story of the rock and roll stuff.
One of the things that I really, really, really enjoyed in your book, My British Invasion by Harold Bronson, was when you talked about the influence of the British bands on the look of our rock and rollers. The fact that they had British teeth, which were never perfect, and that they wore shaggy clothes, and that they weren't manufactured. They were real people, long hair, just the music was the most important thing.
Well, it was really a phenomenal period to grow up in, as a teenager. And, a lot of as we all know, when you experience something, there's a lot of nuances that you are aware of and you retain. Somebody who's, in this case, maybe a lot younger, who didn't grow up with the period, they can read about it. They could be really, fascinated with it. Let me give you a good example of the Turtles. In the Rhino Records story, I have a whole chapter on the Turtles, which is really fascinating. But more specifically, they came from Westchester, which is where I grew up. They were older than me. I knew a couple of their younger brothers. But the Turtles were known as the best band in the area, but as the Crossfires. And when these managers became interested and wanted to sign them, they said, you have to change your name. And they suggested the Turtles, in part because it was kind of like the Birds.
Yeah.
But they said, Turtles, people will think you're English because of Beatles, T-L-E-S, Turtles, T-L-E-S. And in some of the early Turtles gigs outside of Los Angeles, it would say direct from Liverpool. There were American acts that, how about, the Sir Douglas Quintet, Doug Sam from, Texas, but, Sir Douglas, or the first American rock and roll band that fashioned themselves after the Beatles and had hits were not the Birds, but the Beau Brummels. Laugh, Laugh was the first hit. And so Beau Brummel, was the English fashion, from antiquity. And the Beau Brummels, they grew their hair long like the Beatles. They wore suits like the Beatles, and their managers, again, tried to pass them off, at least initially, as English.
An English group. The Beau Brummels, I know the Brummel part went on to create a butter substitute called Brummel and Brown, which I have down in the refrigerator right now. You don't know about that, do you?
You've got a carcass in your refrigerator?
No, not a carcass. I've got some butter substitute. But the Turtles really stuck their neck out, and it was successful. They got cited. Now, who are the two guys in the Turtles?
Howard Kalin.
Howard.
And Mark Volman.
I knew them both. Yeah. I think I met them through you, actually.
Maybe.
Years ago.
But maybe.
Very nice guys.
But they also were on Columbia in the mid-'70s.
Well, that's right. Firesign Theatre was on Columbia Records. So.
Okay, so here's what happened is, their record company, White Whale Records, was falling apart, and they were, the Turtles were owed money. White Whale couldn't pay them, and there was lawsuits flying back and forth. So, as you well know, musical acts, quite often the act was signed exclusively to the record company, but the individuals were as well. So, because of that, when after the Turtles, Howard and Mark, when Frank Zappa asked them to join the Mothers of Invention, which they did, legally, they couldn't use their names. So they called themselves the Fluorescent Leech and Eddie, which were the nicknames given to their two roadies during the Turtles. Wow. And in fact, I think they're credited that the first kind of album that they contributed to, really before they were with the Mothers, was Hot Rats, Frank Zappa's Hot Rats, which was reissued, I think, this year, and I think they're credited that way on that album. But it's so Fluorescent Leech became shortened to Flo, FLO, and so they became Flo and Eddie, just as a name for the new act.
That's wonderful. One of the things that I like also about your book, My British Invasion, is that you talk about the business aspect of the groups. Because believe me, Firesign Theatre, we had our share of legal problems and lawyerly things, and it's fascinating to see how that dynamic often led to a breakup of the group or antagonism within the group.
Yeah.
Okay? Because ownership, same thing happened to the Beatles.
It's interesting. When you're a fan, you like the music and, a little bit that you're exposed to the artist. But your kind of notion is that they're all brothers. Everybody in the group is a brother. They love each other. Yeah. You see A Hard Day's Night, the Beatles are on, they're having fun together. Yep. You don't really know about, this guy's getting all the girls, or I like this girl and this guy got him. I mean, by the way, we're talking about British Invasion, but things like the animosity between Johnny Ramone and Joey Ramone, because Joey's girlfriend at a certain point decided she liked Johnny better and later married him. But I think there was like maybe 2 or 3 years while they were touring and stuff, they didn't talk to each other.
Oh my
God.
But
that's what I'm saying. When you don't know that stuff, or when Brian Jones leaves the Rolling Stones and you think, how could that be?
Yeah,
you have you didn't know that he was the drugs. He couldn't play on the records anymore. The Stones were prevented from coming to America because of the drug bust.
That's right.
You don't know those things.
That's right.
When you're a teenager, early 20s, you start to make records, you don't really know about things like the songwriters get money, or if there's hits, the songwriters get so much more money. Yeah. I think that was some resentment towards Gene Clark, the lead singer, or of the original Birds, who left after a few albums. I think because he was the main songwriter at that point, and he was making so much more money than the other guys. So I think that came into play. That's as one example. But again, the other thing is, when you think about, aside from how you feel about one another, the great music that you make together, and you think that that's not enough to sustain, at least a professional business relationship or a cordial business relationship rather than dissipating.
In your book, you write about what seemed like a complicated relationship that you had with Ray Davies of the Kinks.
So by the way, when you read the name, people refer to the last name as Davies, Ray Davies, but it's actually he pronounces it Davis. But there were 6 sisters, I believe, and Ray, and then 3 years later, then Dave is born, and I think there's a lot of that sibling rivalry and resentment where, Ray was getting all the attention from the family and the sisters, and then the cute baby comes along. So I think that's really the root of it. I mean, that's not the sole reason, but when people think about a lot of these other classic rock and roll groups having reunions and getting together for tours and stuff, curiously, the Kinks haven't. Yeah. And I think, Ray has made so much money as a songwriter and Dave hasn't. I think that, Ray isn't really that motivated. Unfortunately, a reunion hasn't happened yet.
We had an interview with one of the founding members of Devo, Jerry Casale, and of course his brother was, and he told similar stories. Yeah, it's endemic.
Right.
To
Again, by the way,
the world of rock and roll.
The Rhino store was really important to the early days of Devo because they did their first, I think, first 2 singles privately pressed, and at the Rhino store we sold more than anybody.
Wow.
We were like a big Devo. We pushed Devo a lot. But again, you think these guys, coming out from Akron, Ohio, and they're so strange and
like an
goofy,
art project,
and then all of a sudden they become successful, and you think, how could they not all hold it together and be appreciative and But again, another
Hey,
example.
listen, the same thing happened with Firesign Theatre. We had periods where we were silent partners to one another.
Right.
Somebody would get under somebody else's skin, and but we weathered it because whenever we decided to get back together again, we had so much fun, and we're so full of ideas that it allowed us to continue on.
Right. So anyway, as it relates to those stories in both books, where I think something is interesting or relevant, I talk about the business side just to kind of give some perspective or context to what happened.
And one of the things you wrote in the book also was you were inspired to start the record company, the Rhino Records, because of Apple Music and the Beatles.
Yes. Well, there were kind of three influences. One was Jack Holzman's Elektra Records.
Jack Holzman, yes, I remember.
And
Jack.
the thing about the Beatles is a couple things. Is first of all, the quality of those artists. Obviously, not just the Beatles, but Badfinger and Mary Hopkin in the first James Taylor album, and a few other artists. But also, what really struck me is they had ads originally that basically was like, "Send us your tapes." Other things as well. Send us your creative ideas, and it was really unworkable and a little bit too idealistic. But I just love the concept that somebody could come in off the street, and if you liked it, you could put the record out, and that actually happened to us. So it was with that kind of idealistic spirit and the quality that was the inspiration from Apple Records.
And what was the inspiration for the Rhino name and the logo?
Well, the Rhino name came from the record store, which opened in October 1973.
I remember it well.
And Richard Foos, of course, started the store, and then I went to work for him, and later on we started the label as partners. And but we came up with all of these cosmic reasons for Rhino Records, but really it was just the alliteration.
Rhino Records.
Yeah.
Sure.
So our first year, which is really the first year we put out albums, which reflected more of a serious intent, I would say. So that was 1978. I look upon that the first year of the label, even though we put out some singles over the previous 2 or 3 years. So 1978, on our small level, we actually got a little bit of airplay here and there, like the Temple City Kazoo Orchestra. So for instance, K-Rock locally played it, and a few other places. So we had a surprisingly good year, good enough so that at the end of the year, Richard sold the store, and then we went as partners into the label in a different location. But the next year, 1979, just in that 1 year, radio had tightened up. It was like they were playing some of these goofy records we put out the previous year, and in fact, we would have lost money that year. I think we came close to breaking even, primarily because of 2 successful releases, which was, we were talking about Devo earlier. They were so big in LA, we put out a record of, it was a contest through K-Rock where people would send in tapes. So it was Devotees. And then, of course, Nick Danger, the Nick Danger EP we put out.
That's
from
right.
The radio show, which not in 1 year, but over like maybe 2-3 years, I think sold like over 20,000 copies. But it was...
They're all in my garage right now.
I don't think so. But no, basically what I'm saying is like I couldn't understand it. Like we were putting more money into production and making better records. They weren't getting played. They weren't selling that well. It was like so dismal. And then towards the end of the year, those records kind of really pulled us out and made us basically, okay for the year.
In my research about our relationship, it seems to me that the first record that we collaborated on was Fighting Clowns.
Yes.
Yeah, that was in 1980.
Right.
In 82, it was Lawyer's Hospital.
Right.
In 82, it was also Shakespeare's Lost Comedy.
Right.
Which, is one of my very favorite records, and you helped us produce that and get it out there. Then, in 1983, The Three Faces of Al, which was really one of the first CD comedy recordings, nominated for a Grammy.
Well, actually, it was the first spoken word CD.
Was it?
Yeah.
To go back in time here for a moment, we're talking about 30 or 40 years ago and just how different technology was in terms of music listening.
Yeah.
Then it was all about home high-fidelity systems and record players, then tape players, then CD players. Personal listening devices were, at that time, large portable radios that ran on half a dozen D-cell batteries and the occasional bulky headphones. And the other music listening medium was the car radio.
So for me, kind of our generation, when you were young, you were saving money. First, you wanted to own your own car, especially in Southern California. Then secondly, you wanted a really good sound system with big speakers.
Yeah, right.
And the idea was, in some small way, maybe to approximate if you went to a concert and you hear like big sound systems, in a small way, you'd kind of want to experience that at home.
With woofers and tweeters.
Right. And one of the things in subsequent generations, and I have 2 kids who are in their 20s, and it's typical of them and stuff, but when you think about younger people, but people in general listening on laptop computers or maybe earbuds or whatever it is. When we talk about the concept, the name, the group Devo, which was short for de-evolution.
Right.
And when you think about that concept and you think about listening to music, which are, sound waves and richness of, harmonics, and you think about, in the digital age and in the how people listen to it, that's really devolved. I mean, people just, younger people, for the most part, are just not experiencing it, with the sound, the enjoyment that I think that they could.
I heard that vinyl records actually outsold CDs last year because of the nostalgic value and the sound quality.
Yeah, but I mean, ultimately, because CDs have been falling so much.
Well, you're right. That's right.
I mean, it's nice that vinyl has reestablished itself, at least on a small level, and keeps selling more and more every year. But ultimately, it's still small. And, I realize the convenience and of anything you want to hear, whether you own it or whether you, call it up on Spotify or YouTube or whatever it is. But it's still, just really doesn't have the substantial sonic quality of listening, like we used to listen to it in the old days.
All right. So tell me a little bit about your relationship with Richard.
Richard Foos, of course, started the store, and then here's the story how I met Richard. And again, it ties into all the stuff we're talking about. There was a very hip record store on Hollywood Boulevard called Record Paradise, or Lewin's Record Paradise, and they were important in the mid-'60s because they got the British imports. So the British imports, like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones primarily, they had different songs. They had, maybe because of different copyright payment structures, there would be more songs on the English albums. And, of course, they cost a lot more. But they were important. And then, towards the end of the 60s, the same albums that were produced in England were the same as in the U.S. They were homogenized and solidified at that point. It was the same stuff. So they were kind of sliding as far as their mission. But nonetheless, I was there, and they had bootlegs. And another customer, I was looking at bootlegs, and I said, hey, there's this guy who has a record concession in Santa Monica at an electronics store, Apollo Electronics. He's cheaper. You should go there. So I went to Apollo Electronics, which was located in the location where, after the outdoor mall was redone, where the Broadway Deli, you remember on the corner there? For many years it was there. So that's where Apollo Electronics used to be. And so Richard had a corner of the store. And so aside from the fact that he was cheaper, I could also trade in my records there, which meant that, I wasn't like cash out of pocket for buying. And I mean, it was, bootlegs, but he also had like used records. It wasn't like I only bought bootlegs. I mean, I bought, cutouts or used records as well. But so from going there, I just really liked him, his vibe. He was mellow. There were like no other customers, so we would chat. So I got to know him. And then when he was about to open up the record store, I'd saved my promo copies because I felt like I liked him so much. I thought, I really want him to have a good selection when he opens the store. So I was going to England. So this is in like September, October 73. He didn't have a name for the store yet. And I went over to his house with, like, I don't know if it was like a couple hundred records or whatever I gave him for that. And then obviously when I came back, it was Rhino Records. But originally, it was just I really, liked them for various reasons. And then ultimately, as I mentioned before, getting a job, clerking, later becoming manager, and then, forming the label in the back room.
That's great. I mean, that's the way to really form a friendship. Starting sweeping the floors.
I swept the floors.
Yeah, and then you know, my uncle, who was in the motion picture business, Clarence Urist, he was a production manager. He once told me, he said, every great director started just handling cables and working on the lighting and everything. And he said, because of that, if you say to your director of photography, I want a shot where there's the light coming from over here, and pan over and we'll catch it and we'll do a close. Oh no, sir, I can't do that because of the thing. He said, of course you can do it. You put a French cutter there and the brute over here, and he knew his business from the inside out.
Yeah, two important aspects. One is because we just started the label once we moved out of the store, just the two of us and one guy who shipping records. So we divided up all of the jobs that ordinarily a record company would have. So, he did radio promotion. He wasn't very good at it. And then I did radio promotion. I wasn't, good at it. But nonetheless, you call up, the program directors, you send, all that, the colleges. I had my background. I knew about publicity from having been a writer. Richard handled manufacturing and distribution. I mean, we kind of split things up. So if somebody had come up through the ranks of a formal record company, they might have just known one job, just the area, but because we had to learn it all, so that was really helpful. And the other thing is because we didn't work full-time at any record label, we didn't acquire the bad habits. So you definitely see excesses because in the late 70s, initially, again, spurred on by Fleetwood Mac primarily, but you had Michael Jackson. You had these albums which are selling multiple millions, and there was so much money around, then the labels became inefficient and spendthrift to the point where I think it was maybe about 81 or 82, they had to really tighten up and they fired people. But anyway, I'm just saying that we didn't have any of those, we never got any of those bad habits because we weren't exposed to it.
Yeah, like Robin Williams said, cocaine is God's way of telling you you're making too much money.
Yes.
I remember that combination. The Dom Perignon, you'd sprinkle the cocaine on top, which would make the bubbles, and then stir it with a tie stick to take out the bubbles, because that's the part that makes you drunk, and drink it all down.
Wow, I learned something. A lot of times people, they start a company and they have to get, brand new furniture, and they're really keen on, making a big impression. And we were kind of the opposite. And it was if there was a sofa, on the side of the street, Richard would get the truck, and it was not literally, but as an example, we tried to put the most money back into the product, and also at a certain point when we had 2 or 3 years later being able to license from some of the majors, so to reissue. So that was part of it. But the other thing is, back in the store, prior to all of this, we would interact with our customers. We would see what people were buying. We would note things like Gene Vincent. There was a box set that came out of Germany or something that was really impressive. Nobody was doing box sets in the U.S. So 2 or 3 years into our label, we put out a Richie Valens box set, which was the first box set anybody put out in the U.S. So that's what I'm saying, is you would kind of learn from this. But anyway, we love novelty records, which, growing up with, Alan Sherman and Purple People Eater and Stan Freberg, and ultimately, more sophisticated Firesign Theatre. So we loved novelty records, which is always part of top 40, and we could record it cheaply, like the Temple City Kazoo Orchestra. But by the time, we were rolling in that, radio really wouldn't play it. So it's kind of like, well, if it's not exposed, if people don't hear it, they can't buy it. So I was also a champion of local bands, like who were some of the better bands, and we put out some records. But then, I was really surprised that local stations, more specifically K-Rock, wouldn't play it. So again, if like the New Cats or the Pop or the Naughty Sweeties, weren't getting played, then you can't sell it. So that was a big disappointment. So ultimately, the only thing that really worked for us was reissuing. The first best stuff we put out was Alan Sherman. And then, there was the first best of a rock act was Love. And as I mentioned before, because the record labels were focused on selling millions of albums of certain artists, if they could reissue something and sell 5,000 or 10,000 copies, they weren't interested. So it wasn't so much like we saw a niche, let's go after it commercially, we can make a lot of money. It was more like we were fans of these artists. There should be a best of the Spencer Davis Group, it's not out. There should be a best of the Turtles, it's not out. So it was more motivated from that, and the fact that there were other people who felt the same way about this great music as we did, and that kind of ultimately proved to be the winning formula. As we did more of it, we got better at what we did, marketing, production, the quality. But it was always, one difference is the majors, when they would put these out, invariably would be, how could we squeeze money out of these old hits? Right. And they really wouldn't put much into it. For us, it was the opposite. It was, but it's like in life, you get inspired by a lot of things. So I'll give you like one kind of oblique reference. When Haagen-Dazs first came out, it was the first premium ice cream. A higher percentage of butterfat. It costs more. You didn't mind paying more for it. So it was kind of like, okay, it wasn't like literally the connecting the dots of let's be like the Haagen-Dazs of reissues, but it was always, let's put more money into these. Let's have the quality reflect how we felt as record fans. This music was important to us growing up. So let's put that importance into the projects, what we were doing.
And didn't you also work with Weird Al at one point?
Well, not really, but the interesting thing is Dr. Domeno had Weird Al call me.
Oh.
So he came in, I think it was maybe around Thanksgiving break from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. And so what he'd done in the bathroom, I listened to, your podcast, where he talks about it, My Bologna, which of course, satirizing My Sharona, big hits. This was in 1979. So in meeting with him, obviously he was totally out of his element. But in that context of that meeting, off the top of my head, I came up with a great idea. And the idea was, because we were like doing, picture discs, because of, what can we sell? What's our niche that others weren't doing or that we feel that we could sell of? So I said, why don't we do the single? Let's do it like a Bologna picture disc, and let's package it so it looks like, like lunch meat.
Right.
And I thought, great idea off the top of my head. Of course, I never heard from him again.
No,
but, he made the deal with Capitol Records, who, they didn't really care about it. I think they were just doing it to, appease the Knack, who are also on Capitol. So,
the Knack.
But anyway, it came out on Capitol. I think it, sold very little.
You're listening to Phil and Ted's Sexy Boomer Show, and we'll be right back with Rhino Records' Harold Bronson and his magical history tour after this important imported message. Whew.
I'm Bob Dylan, president of the brokerage house Dylan Reed, which I own with my buddy Lou Reed. This week we got a tip for everybody with money in the market. The Federal Reserve has lowered the prime rate again, and we believe this is just the beginning. Come businessmen and farmers throughout the land, call up your stockbrokers just as quick as you can. Your CDs and your IRAs are beyond your command. The Fed is a gradual easing Get your cash in a long bonds for the two in demand. For the interest rates, they are a-changing.
You're listening to Phil and Ted's Sexy Boomer Show. Subscribe to our podcast right now by clicking the subscribe button on your podcast player. Back to Phil Proctor and Ted Bonnet and their special guest, Hollywood producer and co-founder of Rhino Records, Harold Bronson.
We're back with Harold Bronson, co-founder of Rhino Records and producer extraordinaire.
A special friend who I've known for decades, who worked with us as a producer and collaborator on 3 of our most fun albums, Give Me Immortality, Give Me Death, Boom Dot Bust, and The Bride of Firesign, 2 of which were nominated for Grammys. And Harold, with Rhino Records, has a long, long history. You're a very well-rounded person, and I think that is unique, because today people tend to be, again, because of the internet and the media and everything, they get narrowcast. They're more focused on one goal, if you will, and they tend to lose sight of its effect on the entire culture and the world.
So I'm going to flip into this. So my favorite subject in school was history. When I went into college, I was not a history major, because what are you going to do with that? I didn't want to teach.
Right.
But flipping it back, in Rhino, I was dealing with the history of, music and, record companies and stuff. So that's kind of interesting, that arc. But, there's a lot of things that are kind of not that important or not well known. But I'm going to give you one example that, I don't know if it was like a few years ago, just one example where I discovered this. I was reading a book about World War I. And, of course, the United States entered the war, later. But a lot of potential recruits were rejected because their teeth were so poor. And you read about this, and most people, I'm dealing, time frame, a little over 100 years ago, most people they didn't brush their teeth. You don't really think about things like that. You don't really think about, we brush our teeth, we don't really think about it. It's part of everything we do. And you don't really think about, not only did, most people not care for their teeth, but so many, a significant amount were rejected from, being called up in the armed services. So again, it's not a secret, but it's like a nice little kind of like fact that, I'd never read about that before.
No.
So there's lots of those things out there.
It's much better than shooting yourself in the foot.
Oh, yes.
So what are you doing now, Harold?
So my contract and Richard's contract were through the end of 2001 at Rhino. And what was interesting is that because of illegal downloading, sales and profits in the industry were, declining a couple years at that point. Interestingly enough, ours were still increasing. So at that point, we were wholly owned by the Warner Music Group. From my point of view, it seems to me that the head of the Warner Music Group could have been thinking about, well, look, I have all these other problematical areas. Let me focus on that. These guys at Rhino are doing a good job. Let me just, renew, even like for a year or something. But he wanted to have his own guy in there. So I left towards the end of 2001. Richard hung on for a few more months. I think he left in March 2002. So at that point, we were talking about the Turtles earlier. I did a low-budget movie that Howard Kalin wrote, the lead singer of the Turtles, called My Dinner with Jimmy, which was the Turtles went to England for the first time, these kind of naive kids, and they got swirling into the world of English rock and roll. Their heroes,
that's funny.
The Beatles, and Brian Jones taking, with a 8mm camera, taking, movies of them at the Speakeasy Club, and Howard had dinner with Jimi Hendrix at a time when people in America didn't know who he was because he hadn't had a hit here. He had, I think, 1 or 2 hits in England at that point. So I wanted to capture the time. And for the low budget, the movie turned out really well, but I always thought that the better movie you make, the better chance you had to sell it, rather than realizing, well, there's no known stars in here, so therefore, no matter how great it is. So we had real difficulty selling it. So it's available on DVD and I think like on a streaming service. So what I'm saying is, after Rhino, for a few years, even though Richard and I, funded the film, I was a responsible person, and I would have to, whether it's the post-production or trying to sell it or, meetings, whatever it is, part of me was thinking, I'm not going to make any money out of this, but it's my responsibility to oversee it. So there was that, and I really wanted to do rock and roll movies, but that didn't happen. But that and a couple other projects for a few years. And so it took me a few years before I finally was able to get down to focus on the Rhino story.
And you were executive producer of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, about wild man Hunter Thompson, portrayed by Johnny Depp.
Yeah. So that was a Rhino film. So originally that was serialized in 2 issues of Rolling Stone and was so popular that it came out as a hardcover and later on as a paperback. And it was among my favorite books just because part of it was so funny.
Yeah.
And various people had tried to make that, including in the 70s. Did you know the guys in the Conception Corporation?
Oh, absolutely. Sure.
Okay, Howard Cohen. Howard Cohen?
Yep.
Okay, so at one point, I think he might have written the first screenplay way back when. But nobody had been able to make the movie. But at one point, I think, Belushi and Aykroyd were either attached or maybe they were considered for it. And then another time it was, I think, Jack Nicholson. Anyway, nobody was able to make it. And it was still available. And met with Hunter.
Hunter Thompson, ladies and gentlemen.
I had a good relationship with him. I liked him. I think, part of the things about him is I don't think he understood why he was still alive. No, I mean, seriously, I've taken all these drugs, I've abused myself, I've this and this and that, and, what do I do now? What do I do with my life now? And kind of, again, maybe a dot leading to that, but, obviously a number of years he did commit suicide. Part of the contributing factor was he was suffering from back pain. I don't know if he was doing that at the time. But so in the Rhino Records story, I have a whole chapter on Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, and it's really the only good chapter that gives you an overview from the original project and why he wrote it and what he was trying to do, all the way through people trying to make the movie to us trying to make it. And it's so that was in 1998.
You spent time with Hunter Thompson, so you must have some stories.
Yes. Okay, so meeting him for the first time, he was coming into town from Woody Creek, which is outside of Aspen, and we put him up at the Westwood Marquee, which is now the W. We had dinner at the hotel in a reservation, and even though he was upstairs, he was still, I think, 45 minutes late. We ordered drinks and stuff, and he he was flamboyant, and I'm sitting across from him, and I think there's maybe about 8 of us, and he does something which I thought was really funny. So when they bring the bread, there's the little butter dish. I'm sitting across from him. It's so funny. He sweeps his pinky finger in, and he sweeps it up to his nose like he's snorting cocaine. And I'm thinking to myself, ha ha ha. A few seconds later, it's wait a minute, that wasn't the butter dish. That really was his small little container of cocaine. In a public restaurant in the dining room, it made it kind of tense to almost what's he going to do next?
Yeah.
So
that was his charm,
It really was a fear and loathing experience for us, dealing with, the angry Terry Gilliam, doing with this investor on this previous movie. We did a parody of Pulp Fiction called Plump Fiction, who thought he had the right, right. We were sued, and it was really a miserable experience, one of the worst experiences of my life. But what's interesting about it, nothing emanating from Hunter.
Wow.
Although I must say, when he left town, there was a little incident. He and this woman who used to be his paramour, they'd had dinner at a fancy restaurant on La Cienega Boulevard. Fortunately, they were too inebriated to drive the rent-a-car that I paid for, the rent-a-car.
Yeah, right.
I think it was a Mercedes or something, can't remember exactly, but they were inebriated to drive it to the hotel. Great, that's, some wisdom right there. The next day, nobody could find the car. So I was thinking to myself, typically Hunter, would lose the car.
And Terry Gilliam of Monty Python fame, he did all the great animations, later became a film director. And he was brought in to direct Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas.
Yeah, not originally, but what happened, this was hard for us to sell this movie. What happened was, 12 Monkeys, which was Bruce Willis.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Terry directed. It made money for Universal. So Universal was interested in another Terry Gilliam movie.
Yeah.
I mean, like I said, there's lots of stories where, at a certain point, there was after a couple of script revisions, one of the problems was, it was still, the budget was too high. So then he did maybe it was he and his writing partner, I think maybe it was a third script, and it was approved. And I think I was talking to Terry and how are you going to do that? He says, I only did this to, get it approved so we could, he wasn't serious about adhering to,
the budget.
So I think it probably came in 15% over budget or something. I mean, Universal was really pissed off, but what could they do?
Yeah.
But so I think box office, it did, I think maybe around 12.5, 13 million. So, according to their, records and how they account, it's, very much unrecouped, shall we say.
Huh. So have you pursued film production? Is that what you're most interested in now?
Well, what I wanted to do was mostly rock and roll movies because I felt that I understood it better than anybody else and could do it better than anybody else. But there was a run where every rock and roll movie would lose money and the studios wouldn't say, they wouldn't this didn't do well because it wasn't a good movie.
I'd say the subject matter wasn't.
Yeah, so even though I wanted to do a Ramones movie, I wanted to do a movie about the Knack called My Sharona, The True Story, because that had never come out before, and I had a relationship with Doug Feiger, who co-wrote the song and was the singer, and I never even pitched that, even though I worked with him on the story because the climate wasn't good for pitching anything. So again, that's a chapter in the Rhino Records story.
You also worked with John Lydon to make a film about his band, the Sex Pistols.
Yes, trying to do a movie about the Sex Pistols based on his book and having some meetings with him and, an overview of that. And, we wanted to do it. And I think he got, I don't quite know why for cold feet, but he's never, there's never been a Sex Pistols, movie like that told the story.
Is that the project you wanted to call Rotten?
Yeah, that's the name of the book.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
But you thought that might not be good for the reviews.
Right. Well, yeah, that was
Easy target, right?
Yeah, but my point was I thought that, that would be something that would really amuse Johnny.
Sure.
That if the movie was
Rotten.
titled Rotten and if people lambasted the movie, I would see him getting some perverse pleasure out of that.
Contrary to what people who remember may think, as outrageous as they were, the Sex Pistols was not a physically violent band, at least at first.
Well, yeah, for the most part, except here's what happened. A lovely story, but Malcolm McLaren managed these other guys, and John Lydon, later be known more as Johnny Rotten. So they were looking for a singer. They couldn't find a suitable singer. So he auditioned in front of, singing along to Alice Cooper, I'm 18 in the jukebox played. And, that's the guy. So basically, when he joined the group, I think he was a little bit younger than the others, but he's felt a little bit uncomfortable, the other three had been together and playing for a while. So even though the bass player, Glenn Matlock, was pretty good, the fact that he was a Beatles fan was the pretext for Johnny to sort of fire him and get his friend Sid Vicious in, even though Sid, had never played bass before. So Sid was the violent guy. He actually got into some altercations, yeah. But you're right. Aside from him, I'm under the impression that they, weren't violent at all.
What's your take on today's music business? Is it even recognizable to you?
No, I mean, to me, it's really not the music business anymore. We talked about some of that earlier. And when I left Rhino, I would have preferred to have stayed on. But nonetheless, given the confines of what we were all about, and being that I couldn't really branch much more into Rhino films because people weren't really responding to our ideas. I mean, there were a number of other movies I wanted to do. So yeah, it really wasn't a business that I really related to, and I didn't mind stepping away from Rhino and going on to other pursuits, even if personal.
Do you have another book that you're working on?
Well, speaking of which, in a memoir form, it's like a diary. It's a diary, really. But most diaries focus on oneself and one's thoughts, and there's a little bit of that, but mostly it focuses on the artist. What was it like dealing with these artists? What did they have to say about the creative process? What was it like interacting with them? Just a little bit of the business side, but it's mostly, the artist.
Interpersonal stuff. Right?
Yeah.
How can people get your books?
Well, the other two books should be generally available. I mean, of course, Amazon or Barnes & Noble online. Bookstores can order them.
Cool. Well, Harold, this was really a trip through time.
Yes, enjoyed it.
It was a trip through time, and it was so good to see you again.
Thank you, Harold, for joining us.
Well, thank you. Happy to be here and seeing you guys as well.
So this is Phil and Ted, and we want to remind you, please subscribe. We've got a bunch of wonderful guests coming up. Whatever platform you are standing on right now, just step on that subscribe button. And please share our show with all your friends, and I hope you like it. Phil and Ted's Sexy Boomer Show.
So long.
Forward into the past.
You've been listening to Phil and Ted's Sexy Boomer Show, featuring Phil Proctor and Ted Bonnet and special guest Harold Bronson. Dylan Reed was written and performed by Patrick Weathers. Music by Eddie Betos and the Nervous Brothers. I'm A. Ernest Guy. Join us for the next episode of Phil and Ted's Sexy Boomer Show, produced by RadioPictures.com, the makers of fine podcasts for boomers. Okay?